In May 1945, the most powerful military structure Europe had known in the 20th century ceased to exist overnight. More than 3,000 generals and senior officers of the German army disappeared from the map in less than 2 weeks. Some fell in combat, others committed suicide. Hundreds simply vanished into the ruins of the Reich, adopting false identities, crossing borders in the dark, embarking for continents where no one knew their names. No other nation in modern history had lost its entire command structure so suddenly and so absolutely. What happened to the generals of the Third Reich? Some generals chose the battlefield as their last position. They did not wait for courts or negotiate their surrender. They died as the world they had helped build burned around them, some in real combat, others caught in the chaos of a defeat that could no longer be stopped. Walther Model was one of the most capable and brutal generals in the German army. Feldmarschall since March 1, 1944, he was known for his explosive temper and his almost superhuman ability to stabilize collapsing fronts. Hitler called him "my best defensive marshal." Others called him simply the Führer's fireman, because where there was a fire, Model would put it out. By the end of the war, Model commanded Army Group B, locked in the Ruhr pocket, a geographical trap formed by the Anglo-American advance that trapped more than 300,000 German soldiers in an industrial strip east of the Rhine River. It was the largest encirclement of German troops on the Western Front of the entire war. From 1 April 1945, the Ruhr Stock Exchange was systematically compressed. The cities of Duisburg, Essen, and Dortmund fell one after another. The internal communications of the army group collapsed. Model knew there was no way out, but refused to order a formal surrender. He allowed his men to dissolve into small groups, some of which attempted to infiltrate to the east or simply surrendered locally. On April 15, 1945, the last organized resistance of Army Group B ceased. An estimated 317,000 German soldiers surrendered in the following days, a number that surpassed even the surrender of Stalingrad. Model didn't give up. I couldn't do it. In his mind, a German field marshal did not capitulate to the enemy. On April 21, 1945, in a forest near Duisburg, Walther Model shot himself with his service pistol and died instantly. He was 54 years old. His assistants buried him in the forest clandestinely to prevent the body from being found and used for propagandistic. It wasn't until decades later that his remains were formally identified and moved to a military cemetery in Vossenack, in the state of North Rhine-Westphalia. Model's death marked the end of the last pocket of significant resistance on the German Western Front. Ernst Busch was commander of Army Group North in the last months of the war, trying from the Baltic shores to reorganize the remnants of units that had been torn apart by Soviet offensives. He was a man of tough discipline, trained in the fields of World War I, who rose through the Reich machine with the kind of unconditional loyalty that Hitler rewarded and that cost the lives of tens of thousands of his subordinates. Busch died on July 17, 1945, already in British hands, while being held in a prison camp in Aldershot, England. The official cause was a heart attack. He was 59 years old. He was never tried. His death before the start of the Nuremberg trials saved him from facing charges for the orders he signed during the retreat from the Soviet front. Helmuth Weidling occupied a unique place in the history of the end of the Reich. On April 24, 1945, with Berlin almost completely surrounded by the forces of the First Belarusian Front under Zhukov and the First Ukrainian Front under Ivan Konev, Weidling was appointed by Hitler as commander of the city's defense. It was a position he later described as a death sentence with honors. The Berlin garrison consisted of fragmented units, Volkssturm militias made up of older men and teenagers, and some elements of the Waffen-SS. The northern sector of the city was being devoured kilometer by kilometer. The Tiergarten was burning. The Reichstag, the quintessential symbol of dying power, was the scene of hand-to-hand combat that lasted 2 days. On May 2, 1945, Weidling signed the formal surrender of the Berlin garrison. He was taken prisoner by the Soviets and taken directly to NKVD interrogations. A Soviet military court sentenced him to 25 years in prison. He died in a Soviet prison camp in Vladimir on November 17, 1955, at the age of 64. His remains remained on Soviet soil for decades. Georg Hans Reinhardt was one of the Wehrmacht's tank warfare masters, present in the invasion of Poland in 1939, in the French campaign in 1940, where his units crossed the Meuse in just 3 days, and later on the Soviet front in command of Army Group Center. He was a brilliant technician, able to combine mobility and fire in a way that surpassed most of his contemporaries. Reinhardt was captured by the Americans in 1945 and became one of 14 generals charged in the so-called High Command Trial, the 12th trial of the subsequent Nuremberg trials, which began on December 30, 1947. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison for war crimes committed on the Eastern Front, specifically for the implementation of retaliatory orders and the execution of civilians under Barbarossa's directives. He was released in 1952 as part of the clemency reviews promoted by the government of Konrad Adenauer. He died in 1963 in Regensburg. The suicide was not an act of cowardice in the mentality of the German officers of 1945. It was, in many cases, the only alternative that the military culture of the Reich left them. For men who had sworn personal loyalty to Hitler, not to Germany, not to the Constitution, but to man, that man's disappearance created an ethical and psychological vacuum that many did not know how to cross. In addition, the prospect of Soviet capture, with all that that implied, made one's own bullet a rational option for dozens of senior commanders. Hans Günther von Kluge was one of the most senior generals in the German army, commander of Army Group Center on the Eastern Front during 1941 and 1942, and later Supreme Commander of the Western Front in the summer of 1944, following the Allied landings in Normandy on June 6th. Kluge's story is marked by a contradiction that tormented him until the end. He knew about the conspiracy of July 20, 1944, the failed bombing of Hitler in the Wolf's Lair in Rastenburg. But he did not act when he could have made a difference. The conspirators were counting on him. Klaus von Stauffenberg considered him a key player in getting the Wehrmacht on the Western Front to accept the coup. Kluge hesitated. His indecision was decisive for the plot to fail. When the assassination attempt failed and Hitler's retaliation began, Kluge was left in an untenable position, a suspect in the eyes of the Führer, associated without having acted with the executed conspirators. In August 1944, when the front of Normandy collapsed and Army Group West was on the verge of encirclement at Falaise, Hitler dismissed Kluge and ordered his return to Berlin. Kluge knew perfectly well what that call meant. On the 19th of August 1944, traveling by road to Germany, Kluge stopped at Metz. In his driving car, he ingested a potassium cyanide capsule. He was 61 years old. He had written a letter to Hitler urging him to end the war in order to save the German people, and in which he expressed his conviction that Hitler was a great man in spite of everything. An ambiguous letter to the end, written by an ambiguous man to the end. Erwin Rommel's name is perhaps the most well-known among all German generals of World War II, and not only in Germany. Commander of the Afrika Korps in the North African desert from February 1941, Rommel built a reputation as a bold general, brilliant improviser, and sporting adversary that his own enemies admired. Winston Churchill described him before Parliament as a great general. Marshal Bernard Montgomery had a portrait of Rommel hanging in his command motorcade. In North Africa, between 1941 and 1943, Rommel led Axis forces from Tripolitania to the gates of Alexandria, just 100 kilometers from the Nile Delta. The fall of Tobruk in June 1942, with 33,000 British troops captured in a single day, was the high point of their campaign. Hitler promoted him to Feldmarschall on the battlefield at age 50, the youngest general to reach that rank in the history of the German army. But the Desert War was over, without the logistical support that never quite arrived, without the fuel that British submarines intercepted in the Mediterranean, without the armoured divisions that Germany needed on the Soviet front, Rommel was defeated at El Alamein between October and November 1942 by a British army that no longer made the mistakes of the early days. In May 1943, Army Group Africa surrendered in Tunisia. More than 230,000 Axis soldiers were taken prisoner. Rommel, by then, had been evacuated due to illness. He was transferred to the Normandy front in 1944, where he commanded Army Group B in the defense of the Atlantic coast. On July 17, 1944, 3 days before the attack on the 20th of July, the car he was traveling in was attacked by British Spitfire fighter jets near Sainte-Foy-de-Montgomery in Normandy. Rommel suffered serious injuries to his skull, fractures to his temples and parietal bone, multiple contusions. He was hospitalized and spent weeks recovering. He could not, therefore, participate directly in the plot of July 20th. But he was connected to the conspirators. Several of them claimed under torture after the failure that Rommel was in favor of the elimination of Hitler, or at least the negotiation of a separate armistice with the powers Western. Rommel's name came up in interrogations by the RSHA, the Reich's security service. Hitler faced a political dilemma. Publicly executing Germany's most famous general, the hero of the desert, the symbol of military resistance to the world, was politically impossible in October 1944. But letting him go free wasn't an option either. On October 14, 1944, two SS generals, Ernst Meisel and Wilhelm Burgdorf, arrived at Rommel's home in Herrlingen, near Ulm, in Baden-Württemberg. They carried an offer from Hitler. If Rommel took the poison they brought him, his family would be protected, his name would not be stained, and he would receive a state funeral. If he refused, he would be tried before a village court, executed, and his family would be persecuted. Rommel took the cyanide capsule. His daughter Manfred was 15 years old when she saw the father say goodbye at the door. He died in the general's car a few minutes later, on the way to Ulm. He was 52 years old. The official statement announced that Feldmarschall Rommel had died of wounds sustained in the July airstrike. He was buried with full military honors in Herrlingen on the 18th of October 1944, while Goebbels was organizing state mourning throughout the Reich. Hitler sent a wreath of flowers. It was only after the war, during the Nuremberg trials and in the statements of survivors, that the truth of Rommel's forced suicide became known. Fedor von Bock was one of the great commanders of the first period of the war. He commanded Army Group North during the invasion of Poland, Army Group B in the French campaign, and was the man who led the offensive on Moscow in the autumn and winter of 1941, Operation Typhoon. He was less than 20 kilometers from the outskirts of Moscow with his advanced units before the Soviet winter counterattack forced him to retreat. Bock was dismissed by Hitler in January 1942 following the withdrawal, and although he was briefly reinstated to command Army Group South during the 1942 summer offensive into the Caucasus and Volga, he was again dismissed in July of that year. He spent the rest of the war in the reserve, in what was called the Führer's pool of unemployed generals. On May 4, 1945, 3 days after the surrender of Berlin, von Bock was driving with his family near Kiel in Schleswig-Holstein, northern Germany. A Royal Air Force aircraft attacked the column of vehicles in which he was traveling. Bock died instantly, along with his wife and stepdaughter. He was 64 years old. It was an accidental death, a product of the chaos of the last days of the war, when Allied pilots continued to attack any German motorized column they found on the roads. Walther von Reichenau had died before the last act of the war had even begun. He was one of the first senior commanders to die during the conflict. On January 12, 1942, while commanding Army Group South on the Soviet front, he suffered a massive heart attack. He was evacuated by plane, but suffered an accident during the flight and died on January 17, 1942, at the age of 57. Von Reichenau is remembered in history for being the author of the so-called Order of Reichenau of October 10, 1941, in which he demanded that his troops understand that the struggle in the East was a war of annihilation of the Judeo-Bolshevik subhumanity, and that the soldiers should be the bearers of an implacable idea of the people. This order was distributed to other army commanders on the initiative of Hitler himself, who considered it excellent. Reichenau was never tried for her. He died in his hospital bed before the world could ask him for accounts. Kurt Zeitzler was chief of the General Staff of the German Army, OKH, from September 1942 to July 1944, one of the darkest periods of the war for Germany. It was he who coordinated operations on the Eastern Front during Stalingrad, during Kursk, during the continuous retreat that began in 1943. In July 1944, after Hitler systematically ignored his advice and the July 20th conspiracy failed, Zeitzler suffered a total nervous breakdown. He was sent to the hospital and then simply discharged. He survived the war, was briefly detained by the Allies but was not tried at Nuremberg. He lived until 1963 when he died in Hohenachau in Bavaria. In his later years, he participated in writing military studies for the US Army as part of the Foreign Military Studies program. The gallows of Nuremberg did not spare all those who deserved to reach it. But for those who arrived, a justice awaited them that, although late and geopolitically conditioned, was unappealable. These are the generals and commanders who paid with their lives, before formal courts or before the accumulated consequences of their own decisions. The nickname was a play on words in German that circulated even among his own colleagues, Lekitel, a combination of Lakai, Lackey, and Keitel. He was the chief of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the highest operational military position in the German army, the man who signed on paper the orders that Hitler dictated orally. Keitel was born on September 22, 1882, in Helmscherode, Brunswick. He was the son of a middle-class landowner and had served in field artillery in World War I. His rise was methodical, with no brilliant feats on the battlefield. His true talent was administrative. He was efficient, punctual, organized, and above all, infinitely deferential to those above him. When Hitler took direct command of the armed forces in February 1938, dissolving the War Ministry and creating the OKW, Keitel was chosen to head it. The reason was not his tactical genius, which was scarce, but precisely his willingness to obey without question. Other, more capable generals were discarded for having their own opinions. From that position, Keitel signed some of the most criminal orders of the war. The Commissar's Order of June 6, 1941, which instructed German soldiers to summarily execute all captured Soviet political commissars, not merely as enemy combatants, but for what they were. The Night and Fog Decree of December 7, 1941, which established the systematic disappearance of detainees in the occupied territories. People would simply be transferred to Germany without any registration, without information to their families, vanished in the night and fog. On September 16, 1941, Keitel ordered that every German soldier attacked in the east should be met with the execution of 50 to 100 communists, noting in the margin of the document that human life is worth nothing in the east. Captured in Flensburg on May 23, 1945, alongside Dönitz's provisional government, Keitel was transferred to the Ashcan camp in Mondorf-les-Bains, Luxembourg, and later to Nuremberg prison. He first appeared in court on November 22, 1945. His defense argued that he had acted out of obedience to the Führer without autonomy of decision. The court did not believe it. On October 1, 1946, the International Military Tribunal found him guilty on all 4 counts: conspiracy, crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. On October 16, 1946, shortly after midnight, Keitel was taken to the Nuremberg prison gymnasium where the gallows had been set up. U.S. Sergeant Major John C. Woods, executioner in charge of the executions, carried out the hanging. However, there was a serious technical problem. The trapdoor was too small, and Keitel hit his head when he fell. Instead of the quick death from a broken neck that the protocol envisioned, Keitel suffered a 24-minute agony of seizures before being strangled to death. He was 64 years old, His remains, along with those of the others executed that night, were cremated and the ashes thrown into the Isar River near Munich to prevent any place from becoming a shrine. Alfred Jodl was the operative mastermind behind Hitler throughout the war, chief of OKW operations from August 1939 to the end. He was strictly speaking the real planner of the war, the man who translated Hitler's strategic impulses into concrete military orders. He worked directly with the Führer, informing him twice a day about the situation on all fronts. Jodl was born on May 10, 1890, in Würzburg, Bavaria. He was intelligent, meticulous, and had built a reputation as one of the best technicians in the German General Staff. In the early years of the war, he planned the invasion of Norway, the French campaign, and oversaw the operational coordination of the invasion of the Soviet Union. Like Keitel, Jodl signed orders that were central to the charges brought against him at Nuremberg. But unlike Keitel, Jodl had a genuine intellectual capacity to recognize the dimension of what he did, which in a sense compounds his responsibility. In his diaries captured by the Allies, reflections were recorded that show that he perfectly understood the consequences of the orders he endorsed. During his testimony at Nuremberg, Jodl took a different line of defense than Keitel's. Rather than merely pleading blind obedience, he argued that many of Germany's military operations were legitimate under international law then in force, and that military necessity justified some of the measures taken. The court rejected those arguments. On October 1, 1946, Jodl was found guilty on 3 of the 4 counts. On October 16, 1946, he was hanged in the same execution session as Keitel. His ashes were also thrown into the Isar. In a later historical twist, in 1953, a German court attempted to posthumously rehabilitate Jodl, arguing that his actions had been those of an officer carrying out orders. The rehabilitation was judicially revoked in 1960 by the Munich Administrative Court. Ferdinand Schörner was the last Feldmarschall to be promoted to that rank on April 5, 1945, just weeks before the total collapse. He was known for his extreme brutality with his own troops. He signed orders executing German soldiers who retreated without permission, who were separated from their units, who were found without proper documentation. In the final months of the war, Schörner shot hundreds, perhaps thousands, of his own men in an attempt to sustain by terror a defense that was already militarily impossible. When news of the surrender reached on May 8, 1945, Schörner abandoned his troops from Army Group Center in Czechoslovakia and fled in a light aircraft to Austria. His intention was to surrender to the Americans. He was captured days later near Kufstein and later handed over to the Soviet authorities. In Moscow, he was tried in 1952 and sentenced to 25 years in prison. He was released in 1955 within the framework of the agreements for the repatriation of prisoners of war negotiated by Chancellor Adenauer with the USSR. He returned to West Germany, where he was tried again by his own surviving troops, who brought charges of murder. In 1957, a German court in Munich sentenced him to 4.5 years in prison for ordering the illegal execution of German soldiers. He served his sentence and died in 1973 in Munich at the age of 81. The Nuremberg trial, which began on November 20, 1945 and concluded on October 1, 1946, was the first international trial in modern history. The court was composed of 4 principal judges and 4 alternates, one from each Allied power. The chief prosecutors were Robert H. Jackson for the United States, Sir Hartley Shawcross for the United Kingdom, François de Menthon for France, and Roman Rudenko for the USSR. Among the accused, 2 figures directly represented the high-ranking military apparatus. Wilhelm Keitel and Alfred Jodl both executed as described above. But the trial also tried figures who, although not generals of the army, represented the apex of the Reich's military power. Erich Raeder was commander-in-chief of the Kriegsmarine, the German Navy, from 1928 to January 1943, 15 years at the head of the Navy that he himself had rebuilt from almost scratch after the restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles. He was the one who planned and executed the submarine campaign that in 1942 came close to cutting the transatlantic supply lines between the United States and Great Britain. Raeder was indicted at Nuremberg on counts 1, 2, and 3, conspiracy, crimes against peace and war crimes. The prosecution showed that the Kriegsmarine had systematically violated the Hague rules on naval warfare, especially the treatment of castaways and the sinking of neutral ships. His involvement in planning the invasion of Norway in April 1940, which involved attacking a neutral country, was also documented. The court found him guilty on all 3 counts and sentenced him to life imprisonment on October 1, 1946. Raeder was then 70 years old. He was interned in prison of Spandau in Berlin, together with Rudolf Hess. In 1955, he was released on humanitarian grounds, citing health problems. He wrote his memoirs, published in 2 volumes, and died on November 6, 1960, in Kiel, the city that had been for decades the heart of the German Navy. He was 84 years old. Karl Dönitz was the most paradoxical figure of the Nuremberg trial. He was the man Hitler had designated as his successor in his will. It was he who signed the German surrender, who dissolved the Flensburg government on May 23, 1945, who organized the transition, insofar as something so chaotic could be organized, from the Reich to the post-war political vacuum. Dönitz was born on September 16, 1891 in Grünau, near Berlin. He was a submarine officer trained in World War I, where he had been captured by the British in 1918. Between 1939 and 1943, he directed U-boat operations from his headquarters at Lorient on the Breton coast with an efficiency that the British recognized as the gravest threat to their survival in the entire war. In February 1943, German U-boats sank more than 600,000 tons of Allied ships in a single month. He was promoted to Commander-in-Chief of the Kriegsmarine in January 1943, when Raeder requested his own retirement following the failures of the large surface units. And it was Hitler who chose him as his successor in the last days of his life. At Nuremberg, Dönitz was indicted on all counts. His defense lawyer, Admiral Otto Kranzbühler, presented an unprecedented argument. The Hague rules on submarine warfare had been violated by all belligerents, including the American Navy in the Pacific. He presented a statement by Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the American fleet in the Pacific, confirming that U.S. naval forces had also practiced unrestricted submarine warfare against Japan from the first day of the war. The court took note of this in determining the sentence. On October 1, 1946, Dönitz was found guilty on counts 2 and 3, crimes against peace and war crimes, and sentenced to 10 years in prison, the lightest sentence among those sentenced to prison in the main proceedings. He was interned in Spandau prison. On October 1, 1956, exactly 10 years after the sentence, Dönitz was released. He walked out of Spandau at the age of 65, still upright, and retired to a small village near Hamburg in Aumühle. He wrote his memoirs and lived a modest life of retirement. He died of a heart attack on Christmas night, December 24, 1980, at the age of 89. He was buried in the cemetery of Aumühle. Several Navy veterans attended his funeral in uniform, a gesture that sparked protests in Germany. Hermann Göring was, after Hitler, the most powerful man in the Reich, commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe, creator of the Gestapo, minister-president of Prussia, plenipotentiary of the 4-year plan that had turned the German economy into a war machine. In 1939, Hitler had publicly designated him as his successor in the event of death or incapacitation. Göring was born on January 12, 1893, in Rosenheim, Bavaria. He was the son of a diplomat and had a genuine talent for palace intrigues and the accumulation of power. He was also addicted to morphine since he was wounded in the 1923 brewery putsch, an addiction that accompanied him for decades and influenced his military trials in the critical years of the war. The Luftwaffe was Göring's pride and his greatest failure. He failed to destroy the RAF in the Battle of Britain in 1940. He failed to supply the troops locked up in Stalingrad in 1942, despite having personally promised Hitler. He was unable to stop the Allied bombing of Germany that from 1943 reduced entire cities to rubble. Each failure distanced him further from Hitler and further away from reality. Captured on May 7, 1945 by American troops in Austria, Göring was transferred to Camp Ashkan in Mondorf-les-Bains, where American officers were amazed by his physical condition. He weighed more than 130 kilograms, had a deteriorated complexion from years of morphine and excess, and carried with him 20,000 dihydrocodeine tablets in his luggage. He underwent a forced detoxification process that lasted weeks. At Nuremberg, Göring was the most active and intelligent defendant. He systematically challenged prosecutors, denied many of the charges with skillful arguments, and at times ridiculed the least prepared interrogators. The court did not relent. He was found guilty on all 4 counts and sentenced to death by hanging on October 1, 1946. He requested to be executed by firing squad, as befitted a soldier. The request was denied. On the night of October 15, 1946, a few hours before his scheduled execution, Hermann Göring ingested a potassium cyanide capsule. He died in his cell. The origin of the capsule was never officially determined, although later investigators pointed to a contact with an American official. Göring won the last trick against the executioner. Rudolf Hess was the man closest to Hitler in the years of the party's rise. He took part in the beer hall putsch in November 1923, was imprisoned with Hitler in the fortress of Landsberg in 1924, and it was there that he helped Hitler dictate Mein Kampf. On April 21, 1933, he was appointed lieutenant to the Führer. In September 1939, Hitler publicly announced him as the designated successor after Göring. On May 10, 1941, Hess did something that no other Nazi leader would have had the impulse or folly to do. Alone, without informing Hitler, without telling anyone in his circle, Hess took a Messerschmitt Bf 110 from Augsburg airfield and flew to Scotland. He parachuted near the Duke and Duchess of Hamilton's estate in Eaglesham, convinced that he could negotiate a separate peace with Britain through aristocrats with whom he had had contact before the war. The British took him prisoner. Hitler, when he found out, declared him insane and ordered his symbolic arrest in absentia, informing the German public that Hess suffered from hallucinations related to war wounds. Hess spent the rest of the war in British custody, being interrogated in various facilities. The psychiatrists who examined him debated for decades whether he really suffered from a disorder or if he was simply acting to avoid being judged. At Nuremberg, Hess appeared showing signs of partial amnesia that many considered simulated. He was found guilty on counts 1 and 2, conspiracy and crimes against peace, and sentenced to life imprisonment. The Soviets disagreed. In their opinion, Hess deserved death. Hess was interned in Spandau prison in Berlin, along with Raeder, Dönitz, Baldur von Schirach, Albert Speer, and others. When the others were released, Hess remained. The 4 powers maintained a rotating guard at Spandau. The Soviets repeatedly refused to approve his release, even when he was already the only remaining prisoner in a prison built for 600 people and maintained with expensive personnel from the 4 powers. On August 17, 1987, Rudolf Hess was found dead in the garden of Spandau prison. He was 93 years old. He wore an electrical cord around his neck. Authorities determined that he had hanged himself using a lamp wire. His son, Wolf Rüdiger Hess, never accepted this conclusion and maintained that his father was murdered, although independent investigators found no evidence to support that theory. With his death, Spandau prison was demolished. The building was torn down so that it would not become a neo-Nazi pilgrimage site. Dozens of generals were convicted. Few served all their sentences. The Cold War reconfigured the priorities of the victors with a speed that left many victims unanswered and many perpetrators enjoying a freedom that the logic of Nuremberg should never have granted them. Erich von Manstein is considered by many military historians, including Allied critics of the time, to be the most operationally talented general to produce World War II. His name is inseparable from Germany's greatest military successes. It was he who conceived the plan to invade France in 1940, the audacious coup through the Ardennes that resulted in France's defeat within 6 weeks. It was he who led Kharkov's counterattack in February and March 1943, the largest German offensive recovery operation after Stalingrad, which stabilized the southern front for several more months. Von Manstein was born on November 24, 1887 in Berlin, the adopted son of a family of the Prussian military high nobility, hence the von. He was intelligent, aristocratic, and deeply aware of his own genius, which put him in permanent conflict with Hitler, who did not tolerate generals who had more intelligent opinions than his own. After the war, Manstein was tried not at Nuremberg, but by a British court in Hamburg in 1949. The charges included responsibility for crimes committed by troops under his command on the Soviet front between 1941 and 1944, executions of Jews by Einsatzgruppen operating in his area of responsibility, treatment of Soviet prisoners of war, and reprisals against civilians. Manstein alleged that he had not given these orders directly, that SS units were not under his direct command, and that he had opposed some of these practices. He was convicted on 18 of the 24 counts and sentenced to 18 years in prison in December 1949. The ruling sparked intense debates in the United Kingdom and West Germany. Winston Churchill, now in opposition, openly criticised it. Former British Field Marshal Archibald Wavell visited Manstein in prison. A signature campaign collected hundreds of thousands of supporters for his release. In 1952, after eye operations, Manstein was released for health reasons. In the following years, he became one of the most influential advisors to the new German army, the Bundeswehr, whose operational doctrine drew directly from his experiences and writings. He published his memoirs, Lost Victories, Verloren Siege, in 1955, a work that continues to be widely studied in military academies around the world. He died on June 9, 1973 in Irschenhausen, Bavaria, at the age of 85. Albert Kesselring was the German commander who, for 22 months, between September 1943 and May 1945, led a defense of Italy that kept the Allied forces, superior in numbers, equipment and air support, advancing at an average rate of less than 2 kilometers per day through the mountainous terrain of the Apennines. Kesselring was born on November 30, 1885 in Markstedt, Bavaria. Originally an artillery officer, he was transferred to the Luftwaffe in 1936 and rose to command entire air fleets in Poland, France and the Battle of Britain. From December 1941, he commanded the Axis forces in the Mediterranean theatre. In Italy, his ability to build defensive lines on the ground, the Gustav Line, the Gothic Line, and to make local counterattacks that regained lost positions left the Allies frustrated for years. General Harold Alexander, who commanded the Allied forces in Italy, called him the most skilled enemy we have ever faced. But Kesselring also signed orders that resulted in massacres of civilians. In March 1944, in retaliation for a partisan attack on Rome that killed 33 German SS soldiers on the Via Rasella, Kesselring approved the execution of 335 Roman civilians in the Fosse Ardeatine. The men, including 75 Jews, were taken away in trucks, forced to kneel in small groups, and executed with a shot to the back of the head. Blood accumulated up to 30 centimeters on the floor of the caves. A British court sentenced him to death on that and similar orders in May 1947. The sentence was commuted to life imprisonment in 1947, and Kesselring was finally released in 1952 for health reasons. Upon his release from prison, he became an active figure in German veterans' associations and in the internal politics of the Christian Social Union in Bavaria. He died on July 16, 1960 in Bad Nauheim at the age of 74. Gerd von Rundstedt was 65 years old when World War II began and had served in the German army since World War I. He was the oldest officer in the German army on active duty, which gave him an almost untouchable status, even for Hitler. Von Rundstedt commanded Army Group South during the invasion of Poland, Army Group A during the French campaign, where his units executed the crossing of the Ardennes that broke the Allied front, and was subsequently the first commander of Army Group South in the invasion of the Soviet Union. He was dismissed by Hitler in December 1941 for ordering a retreat without express permission in the face of the Soviet counterattack. Hitler reinstated him in 1942, then dismissed him again in 1944 following the failure to halt the Allied advance following the Normandy landings. He recommissioned him to oversee the Ardennes offensive in December 1944, and he dismissed him once again in March 1945. Captured by American forces at Bad Tölz, Bavaria, in May 1945, Rundstedt was arrested but ultimately not tried at Nuremberg. Charges for his role in the repression in the occupied countries and for the implementation of the Commissioner's order were brought by Poland, but Rundstedt was excluded from the main trials on the grounds of his advanced age and severe heart problems. He was definitively released in 1948. He died on February 24, 1953 in Hanover at the age of 77. Heinz Guderian is the name most associated with the development of modern armoured warfare. In the 1930s, he developed the Panzer doctrine that transformed cavalry units into tank divisions capable of advancing 100 kilometers in a day. His ideas, previously ignored by the conservative military hierarchy, found an echo in Hitler and were implemented with devastating results. In the Polish campaign of 1939, its armoured units advanced faster than the High Command itself thought possible. In the French campaign of 1940, it was Guderian who crossed the Meuse in Sedan on 13th May, and then, disobeying orders to stop that he considered incomprehensible, advanced towards the English Channel, encircling the Allied army group to the north. In Operation Barbarossa in 1941, his Panzergruppe advanced 300 kilometers in the first days of the Soviet front. Guderian was dismissed by Hitler in December 1941 for ordering withdrawals on the Moscow front without authorization. He was reinstated in 1943 as Inspector General of the Armored Forces, and in July 1944, after the July 20th bombing, he was appointed Chief of Army Staff, OKH. In that position, he had permanent conflicts with Hitler, whom he sometimes directly contradicted in the presence of other generals, something that very few dared to do. He was definitively dismissed on March 28, 1945. Guderian was arrested by American forces at the end of the war. He was interrogated extensively, but was not prosecuted at the Nuremberg trials. Investigators later pointed out that his relationship with the criminal orders on the Eastern Front was more complex than his memoirs. Written in 1950 under the title Erinnerungen eines Soldaten, Recollections of a Soldier, acknowledged. Guderian died on May 14, 1954, in Schwangau, Bavaria, at the age of 65. By the time the Allied courts began searching for them, many were no longer in Europe. They had crossed the Alps on foot, slept in barns, falsified names and professions with the help of networks that mixed religious devotion with deliberate complicity. Some never returned. Others lived for decades under new names on continents that asked them no questions. There are generals who escaped not only justice but public memory, buried under the weight of crimes that even in the context of war were extremely difficult to justify. Walter Rauff is one of them. Rauff was not a general in the army, but an SS Standartenführer, the equivalent of a colonel. But his story illustrates the escape nets that some generals also used. Rauff was the official responsible for the development and deployment of the gas trucks, vehicles in which prisoners were locked in the back while the exhaust engines were driven inside. It is estimated that approximately 97,000 people were killed in this way on the Soviet and North African fronts. Rauff was captured by the Americans in 1945, but managed to escape from a prison camp in 1946. He arrived in Italy using escape routes partially organized by Austrian priest Alois Hudal, rector of the Teutonic College of Santa Maria dell'Anima in Rome, who provided letters of recommendation and certificates of identity issued by the Catholic Church to fugitives seeking to emigrate to South America. Rauff arrived in Chile in 1958. passing through Syria and Ecuador first. In Chile, an international arrest warrant issued by West Germany in 1962 was rejected by Chilean courts in 1963, which found that the statute of limitations had expired. Rauff lived openly in Punta Arenas until his death on May 14, 1984. The case of Reinhard Gehlen is unique. He was the only senior Wehrmacht officer to go directly from enemy commander to employee of the United States Army in less than a year, without judicial process in between. Gehlen was chief of the intelligence forces on the Eastern Front, Fremde Heere Ost, FHO, from 1942 to 1945. In that position, he built the most sophisticated intelligence network Germany had on the Red Army. Agents behind Soviet lines, analysis of troop movements, assessments of industrial capabilities, maps of military installations. In May 1945, Gehlen surrendered to American forces in Bavaria, taking with him the complete FHO archive, microfilmed and hidden in warehouses in the Alps. The offer he made was straightforward: intelligence on the Soviet Union in exchange for protection and freedom. The Americans accepted. In 1946, Gehlen was transferred to Fort Hunt, Virginia, where he signed a cooperation agreement with the American Army. In 1949, he returned to Germany under American protection to establish the so-called Gehlen Organization, which operated from facilities in Pullach, Bavaria. In 1956, when West Germany established the Bundesnachrichtendienst, the BND, the Secret Foreign Intelligence Service, Gehlen became its first director, a position he held until 1968. The Gehlen organization absorbed more than 4,000 former members of the German armed forces and SS as collaborators between 1946 and 1955, initially funded by the CIA and supervised from Munich. Its agents included figures whose involvement in war crimes was documented, but who were protected because of their operational utility. Gehlen died on June 8, 1979 in Berg, on the shores of Lake Starnberg in Bavaria. He was 77 years old. Lothar Rendulic was one of the most ruthless generals of the German army on the Eastern Front and in the Scandinavian theatre. Austrian by birth, born on November 23, 1887 in Wiener Neustadt, he had served in the Austro-Hungarian army during World War I and joined the Wehrmacht after the Anschluss of 1938. Rendulic ordered in October 1944, during the German withdrawal from Finland through the Norwegian province of Finnmark, the systematic destruction of everything that could not be taken with it. Entire villages were burned, bridges, roads, port facilities. The civilian population, some 43,000 Norwegian civilians, was forced to evacuate in the middle of the Arctic winter. The scorched earth policy he implemented in Finnmark left the region devastated for years. In trial number 7 of the Nuremberg trials, known as the hostage trial, the hostage case, Rendulic was one of the defendants. He was convicted in 1948 and sentenced to 20 years in prison. However, in 1951 the sentence was reduced to 10 years, and he was released that same year after serving only 3 years. He died on January 18, 1971 in Graz, Austria. No aspect of the post-war period is more puzzling from a contemporary perspective than the speed and scale with which former Wehrmacht generals became founders, advisors and commanders of the new armies of the Cold War. Adolf Heusinger was head of the operations department of the OKH, the General Staff of the Army, from 1940 to 1944, which made him one of the central planners of the war on the Soviet front. On July 20, 1944, Heusinger was standing next to Hitler in the Wolf's Lair when the von Stauffenberg bomb exploded. He was lifted by the blast wave but survived with minor injuries. Briefly detained on suspicion of involvement in the plot, he was exonerated and continued on active duty until the end of the war. Captured by the Americans in 1945, he participated extensively in the U.S. Army's Foreign Military Studies program, producing analysis on the Eastern Front campaigns that became reference material for American military doctrine during the Cold War. In 1950, Heusinger participated in the meeting of the Himmerod Monastery. convened by Chancellor Adenauer to discuss the possibility of rearming West Germany. The report resulting from that meeting, the so-called Himmerod Memorandum, set out the principles for the creation of the Bundeswehr. On November 12, 1955, a symbolic date coinciding with the 200th anniversary of Clausewitz's birth, Adenauer formally established the Bundeswehr. Heusinger was appointed the first Inspector General of the new German army, the highest position in the chain of command of the armed forces. In 1961, he was appointed chairman of the NATO Military Committee in Washington, the highest military position in the alliance, which he held until 1964. He died on November 30, 1982 in Cologne, at the age of 85. Hans Speidel was the staff officer who in 1944 served as Chief of Staff of Army Group B under Rommel in Normandy. He knew of the plot of July 20th and facilitated Rommel's contacts with the conspirators. He was arrested by the Gestapo in September 1944, but managed to survive the collapse of the Reich without being executed, in part thanks to the intervention of academic figures who interceded for him. After the war, Speidel was actively involved in discussions about the rearmament of West Germany. He was one of the architects of the concept of inner leadership, innere Führung, the doctrine that sought to integrate democratic values into the new German military culture, explicitly differentiating it from the blind obedience of the Imperial Army and the Reich. In 1957, Speidel was appointed Commander-in-Chief of NATO's ground forces in Central Europe, based in Fontainebleau, France, the highest position a German general had held in a multilateral alliance since World War I. Retired in 1963, he died on November 28, 1984 in Bad Honnef, aged 87. Hasso von Manteuffel was one of the boldest armoured commanders of the last phase of the war. In December 1944, commanding the 5th Panzer Army during the Ardennes offensive, his units advanced to the closest point to the Meuse that German forces would reach on the Western Front since 1940. Only the desperate resistance of the American 101st Airborne Division at Bastogne, General McAuliffe's famous nuts response to the demand for German surrender, and the weather conditions that finally allowed the intervention of the Allied aviation halted the advance. Von Manteuffel was captured by American forces in 1945 and was tried in 1947 by a German court in Nice for the execution of a deserting soldier. He was sentenced to 18 months in prison. Released, he went on to collaborate with tactical studies for the American Army, describing the operations of the Ardennes with the meticulousness of the one who had designed them. In the 1950s, von Manteuffel entered German politics as a member of the Liberal Democratic Party, FDP, and was elected to the Bundestag in 1953, where he served until 1957. He died on September 24, 1978 in Reith im Alpbachtal, Austria, at the age of 79. The defeat did not mean the same thing for everyone. For a handful of German generals, the collapse of the Reich was also the collapse of a loyalty they had maintained not out of conviction but out of inertia. Captured by the Red Army, subjected to months of interrogation and political re-education, some chose a path that their comrades considered treason, serving the new German communist state built under Soviet supervision. Vincenz Müller was one of the German generals who chose the completely opposite path to that of Heusinger or Speidel. Captured by the Soviets in the catastrophe of Army Group Center in the summer of 1944, Operation Bagration, in which the Red Army destroyed more than 28 German divisions in a few weeks in the greatest military disaster in German history, Müller was subjected to the procedures of the Soviet NKVD to turn high-ranking prisoners into political collaborators. In the Soviet Union, Müller joined the National Committee for a Free Germany, an organization of captured German officers that made propaganda calling on their countrymen to surrender or resist Hitler. When the German Democratic Republic was established, Müller returned and became one of the founders of the National People's Army, National Volksarmee NVA. In 1950, he was appointed Chief of Staff of the Armed Forces of the GDR. He died in 1961 in East Berlin. The case of Arno von Lenski was similar to that of Müller. Captured at Stalingrad in 1943 in command of the 24th Panzer Division, Lenski also joined the National Committee for a Free Germany from the Soviet camps. He returned to the area. He became a member of the Soviet Union in Germany after 1945 and held positions in the administration of the new German communist state. He died in 1986 in East Berlin. The existence of these generals in the GDR army illustrates a little-known dimension of post-war German military history. The military apparatus of the German communist state was also built in its first decades on the experience and expertise of former Wehrmacht officers, albeit oriented in a completely different ideological direction. While the Allied courts were deliberating at Nuremberg, hundreds of German officers were already on the move. They crossed the Alps in the dark, slept in granaries in northern Austria, mingled with columns of displaced civilians. His destination was not prison, it was another continent, another name, another life built on the deliberate oblivion of the previous one. Friedrich Rüger was the vice-admiral who served as a naval representative at Rommel's headquarters in France during 1944. He was well aware of the limitations of German defenses on the Atlantic coast, and his later memoirs of his conversations with Rommel became an important primary source. After the war, Rüger was not prosecuted. He became a naval historian and published studies on warfare at sea that were widely used by Western naval academies. When West Germany established the Bundesmarine, the new German Navy, in 1956, Rüger was appointed its first Inspector General. He died on July 3, 1985, in Tübingen at the age of 91. Hans-Ulrich Rudel was the most decorated pilot of the German Luftwaffe. In his Stuka missions, he shot down more than 500 Soviet tanks, 800 vehicles, and participated in the sinking of the Soviet battleship Marat in September 1941 with a 1,000-kilogram bomb. He was the only German soldier to receive the Knight's Medal of the Iron Cross with oak leaves, swords, and diamonds. Rudel was not technically a general. He was a colonel at the time of the surrender, but he is a paradigmatic example of the Nazi exile in South America. After the war, he settled first in Argentina, where he had documented links with circles of former Nazis in Buenos Aires, and later moved to Paraguay, where the regime of Alfredo Stroessner granted him citizenship and where he acted as an intermediary for the immigration of other German ex-combatants. He returned to West Germany in 1953, where he published his memoirs and became a cult figure among sectors of the radical right. He died on December 18, 1982, in Rosenheim, Bavaria. The so-called rat lines were evasion networks initially established for former SS members, but also used by Wehrmacht officers. Its operation was based on local contacts, forged documents, and logistical support provided by church institutions and humanitarian organizations in Italy and Austria. The Austrian priest Alois Hudal, rector of the Teutonic College of Santa Maria dell'Anima in Rome, was one of the key figures. Hudal provided letters of recommendation and certificates of identity that allowed fugitives to obtain documents from the International Red Cross. The main routes crossed the Alps to Bolzano, Trento, and Rome, where fugitives received travel documents at the ports of Genoa and Trieste. The ships left for Spain, Syria, Egypt, and Latin America. The files of the American CYC, the Army Corps Counterintelligence, confirmed the involvement of several former Wehrmacht officers in those same networks, along with elements of the SS. Argentina, under the government of Juan Domingo Perón, implemented a broad immigration policy toward displaced Europeans between 1946 and 1950. More than 30,000 Germans, Austrians, and Croats arrived at its ports. The files of the Argentine Ministry of Foreign Affairs show residence applications processed with certificates issued by the Red Cross in Rome. Syria and Egypt also received former German military personnel as technical advisors. Between 1949 and 1953, former members of the Wehrmacht participated in the reorganization of the Egyptian army and the training of armored units. Several of them acquired local nationality and remained in those countries until their deaths. The Nuremberg trial of 1945 to 1946 was only the first in a series. Between 1947 and 1949, the American military tribunals conducted 12 additional trials at Nuremberg under Allied Control Council Act No. 10. The most relevant to the Wehrmacht's command structure was the High Command trial, officially called United States of America versus Wilhelm von Lieb et al., initiated on December 30, 1947. Wilhelm von Lieb was commander of Army Group North during Operation Barbarossa in 1941, with the mission of advancing through the Baltic states towards Leningrad. His troops reached the outskirts of Leningrad in September 1941, initiating the longest siege of the war, 872 days, during which more than 1 million civilians died of hunger, cold, and bombing. In the High Command trial, von Lieb was accused of the application of the Commissioner's Order, of reprisals against civilians, and of the behavior of troops under his command in the Baltic territories. He was convicted in 1948 and sentenced to 3 years in prison, a sentence that was deemed effectively served by the time he had spent in detention. He was immediately released. He died on April 29, 1956 in Hohenschwangau, Bavaria. Hermann Hoth was one of the German army's masters of tank warfare. Commanding the 3rd Panzer Group in Barbarossa in 1941, his columns advanced from the Soviet border to the outskirts of Moscow in the autumn of that year. He subsequently commanded the 4th Panzer Army during the Battle of Kursk in July 1943, the largest armoured engagement in history. In the High Command trial, Hoth was found guilty on orders that resulted in the execution of civilians and prisoners of war on the Eastern Front. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison in 1948. He was released in 1954. He died on January 25, 1971, in Goslar, Lower Saxony. For those captured on the Eastern Front, the war did not end on May 8, 1945. He ended up years later in labor camps in Siberia, in military hospitals in Ukraine, in interrogation cells in Moscow where the cold reached the bones and the questions never stopped. These generals did not face judges with wigs or prosecutors with briefcases. They confronted the Soviet system, which had its own ways of holding them accountable. On January 31, 1943, Friedrich Paulus surrendered to Soviet General Mikhail Shumilov in a basement of the Uniwehrmacht warehouse in Stalingrad. He was the commander of the German 6th Army, trapped since November 23 by the Soviet Operation Uranus in an encirclement from which Hitler had forbidden him to escape, promising an air supply that never came. The 330,000 men locked in the cauldron died in their thousands a week in temperatures of minus 40 degrees Celsius in field hospitals set up in the basements of destroyed factories. The day before, Hitler had promoted him to Feldmarschall, an implicit message that Paulus ignored. No German Feldmarschall had ever been captured alive. In the Soviet Union, he was accommodated in relative comfort in the villa of Suzdal. In August 1944, he broke with the Reich, joining the National Committee for a Free Germany and making radio statements calling for German surrender. He testified at Nuremberg as an indictment against his former comrades. After the war, he settled in Dresden, in the GDR, where in 1953 he publicly defended the socialist system. He died on February 1, 1957, exactly 14 years after the surrender at Stalingrad. He was 66 years old. Hitler sentenced him to death in absentia on April 9, 1945, the same day that Lasch signed the surrender of Königsberg. The fortress had endured weeks under siege by the Third Belarusian Front. The city was burning, ammunition had run out, and civilians were dying in basements as the Soviets advanced street by street. Lasch negotiated the surrender to avoid the total annihilation of the 35,000 men who still survived inside the encirclement. A Soviet military court sentenced him to 25 years in prison. He was repatriated to West Germany in 1955, where he published his memoirs about the battle and died on April 29, 1971, in Freiburg im Breisgau, aged 77. Commander of Army Group South in the final months of combat in Hungary and Austria, Wöhler was captured by Soviet forces in May 1945 and transferred to Moscow for interrogation. A Soviet military court convicted him in 1946. He was detained in NK-FID facilities for nearly a decade. He was repatriated to West Germany in 1955. Under the same agreement that returned the rest of the German prisoners of war, he returned as a weakened old man. He died on January 7, 1987 in Hagen, aged 90, having outlived almost all of his contemporaries. Helmuth von Panwitz was the commander of the SS Cossack Cavalry Corps, a unit composed of Soviet Cossacks who had chosen to fight alongside Germany. In May 1945, von Panwitz and his troops surrendered to British forces in Austria. What followed was the so-called Operation Kielhorn. The Western Allies handed over the Cossacks and their German officers to the Soviet authorities in compliance with the Yalta agreements. Von Panwitz was transferred to Moscow. On January 16, 1947, he was hanged in Lefortovo prison along with 5 Cossack leaders, accused of treason and war crimes. He was 43 years old. In 1996, he was rehabilitated by the Russian Prosecutor General's office, a decision that generated international protests. Karl Strecker commanded the 11th Army Corps, the last German pocket of resistance organized in Stalingrad, while Paulus surrendered on January 31, 1943. In the southern sector, Strecker held his positions in the north of the city for 2 more days. On February 2, 1943, at 8:40 a.m., Strecker sent his last telegram to the OKW. The 11th Army Corps, with its 6 divisions, has done its duty to the last man. Long live Germany! Then he gave up. He was taken to Soviet camps, where he remained for a decade. He returned to West Germany in 1955 and died in 1973 in Minden, aged 85. Walther von Seydlitz-Kurzbach was captured at Stalingrad in January 1943 in command of the 51st Army Corps. In the Soviet Union, he made a decision that made him the most active officer of the National Committee for a Free Germany. Not only did he sign manifestos calling for German surrender, but he actively proposed organizing military units of German prisoners to fight against Hitler. The Soviets never implemented this proposal on a large scale, but the figure of Seydlitz was used intensively in psychological warfare against German troops at the front. A German military court sentenced him to death in absentia in 1944 for treason. The sentence was never carried out. He was released by the Soviets in 1955 and returned to Bremen, where the West German government initially refused to recognize any rights to him. He died on April 28, 1976, in Bremen at the age of 83. Hans von Salmuth was commander of the 17th Army on the Eastern Front and of the Army 15 on the French coast during the preparation of the defenses against the Allied landings of 1944. He was tried in the High Command trial and sentenced in 1948 to 20 years in prison for the application of criminal orders on the Eastern Front, including the execution of civilians and complicity in the operations of the Einsatzgruppen in the territories under his command. In 1953, he was released. His case went almost completely unnoticed by German public opinion at the time. He died on January 1, 1962 in Wiesbaden at the age of 73. Not everyone who deserved a court made it to one. Old age, health problems, strategic utility, or simply post-war administrative chaos protected several generals from the formal consequences of their actions. They lived in the New Germany or in exile, writing memoirs, giving lectures, receiving pensions. History judged them. The courts do not. Gotthard Heinrici was the commander who had the most impossible task of the last chapter of the war on the Eastern Front: to defend Berlin against the Soviet offensive of April 1945. Commanding Army Group Vistula, Heinrici attempted to prepare defenses in depth on the heights of Seelow, east of the Oder River, using elastic defense techniques that required withdrawing troops before the pre-offensive bombardment and placing them back immediately afterwards. The effort was remarkable and delayed Zhukov's advance in the first hours, but the numbers were impossible. The Red Army concentrated more than 2.5 million men, 6,250 tanks, 7,500 aircraft and 41,600 artillery pieces, the largest concentration of offensive force in the history of war. Heinrici was dismissed by Hitler on April 28, 1945, for ordering unauthorized withdrawals. Captured by British forces, he was arrested but not formally prosecuted. He died on December 13, 1971 in Heilbronn at the age of 83. Kurt Student was the creator and commander of the German parachute troops, Fallschirmjäger, one of the most amazing tactical innovations of World War II. His forces captured the Eben-Emael Bridge in Belgium in May 1940 in a glider assault, and in May 1941 executed the conquest of the island of Crete from the air, the first aerial invasion of an island in history, at such a high cost that Hitler never authorized a similar operation again. Student was arrested and briefly tried for crimes committed in Greece and Crete, but the trial did not end in conviction. He was released and lived until July 1, 1978, when he died in Lemgo, North Rhine-Westphalia, at the age of 88. Its paratroopers were reabsorbed by the Bundeswehr in the 1950s, although they never named Student directly as its founder. Maximilian von Weichs oversaw the anti-partisan war in Yugoslavia from 1943 to 1945, a conflict in which reprisals against civilians were official doctrine. 100 civilians executed for every German soldier killed. Historical estimates put the number of Yugoslavs killed during the occupation at more than 1 million. Von Weichs was charged in the High Command trial in 1947, but court doctors determined that his heart condition was incompatible with the trial. The charges were suspended indefinitely. He was released in 1948 and died on 27 September 1954 in Borberg, North Rhine-Westphalia, aged 71, without having been brought before any court. Nicholas von Falkenhorst led the occupation of Norway from the invasion of April 9, 1940, until December 1944. The 773 Norwegian Jews who did not manage to escape to Sweden were arrested and deported to the extermination camps in the east under the framework of the occupation over which he presided. Only 34 returned. A British military court sentenced him to death in 1946, a sentence commuted to 20 years. In 1953, he was released for health reasons. He died on June 18, 1968 in Aschau im Chiemgau, Bavaria, at the age of 82. Johannes Blaskowitz was the only high-ranking general to formally lodge a written protest with the OKW against SS atrocities in Poland in 1939 and 1940, documenting in detail executions, rapes, and looting. Hitler dismissed him in 1940. He was the only defendant in the Nuremberg sub-trials to die during the trial. On February 5, 1948, he fell from an interior gallery into the prison courtyard of the Nuremberg Palace of Justice. The circumstances, suicide, accident, or intervention of third parties, were never determined with certainty. He was 64 years old. The man who had dared to denounce the crimes of his own comrades died before history could pronounce its final verdict. In August 1944, Dietrich von Koltitz was ordered to demolish Paris before its fall, blow up the bridges, destroy Notre Dame, set fire to the museums. Hitler repeatedly asked on the phone, "Is Paris burning?" It did not burn. Von Koltitz refused to execute the orders and signed the surrender of the garrison on August 25, 1944, to General Philippe Leclerc. Captured and taken to a prison camp in the United States, he returned to West Germany in 1947. He was not prosecuted for his previous acts on the Eastern Front and in the Mediterranean, which deserved scrutiny that never came. He died on November 5, 1966, in Baden-Baden at the age of 71. The city he saved granted him honorary citizenship posthumously. Erich Höppner was dishonorably dismissed by Hitler in January 1942 for ordering a tactical retreat that saved thousands of lives on the Moscow front. Deprived of rank, uniform, and pension, he joined the conspiracy of July 20, 1944. When the attempt failed, he was arrested that same night, tried before the Court of the People's Movement, where he was publicly humiliated, forced to appear without a belt so that his pants would fall in front of the cameras, and hanged on August 8, 1944, in Plötzensee, Berlin. The Allies were never able to try him because the Nazi regime itself had executed him 9 months before the end of the war. His case illustrates that some of those who tried to stop the regime from within paid a price that the Nuremberg tribunals never had to impose. Hans-Jürgen von Arnim was the commander of Army Group Africa that surrendered in Tunis to British forces on May 12, 1943, ending the North African campaign. More than 230,000 Axis soldiers capitulated that day. Arnim was taken to Britain as a high-ranking prisoner, interned in camps for senior officers for the rest of the war. He was released in 1947 without having been formally prosecuted. There is no record that he was summoned as a witness or accused in any of the subsequent trials. He died on September 1, 1962 in Bad Wildungen, Hesse, at the age of 72. Georg von Küchler commanded the 18th Army during the invasion of the Netherlands in May 1940 and was responsible for the bombing of Rotterdam on the 14th of that month, which destroyed the city's historic centre and killed more than 800 civilians when surrender negotiations were already underway. He subsequently took command of Army Group North on the Soviet front, presiding over the maintenance of the siege of Leningrad from 1942 to 1944. Tried in the trial of the High Command in 1948, he was sentenced to 20 years in prison, released in 1953. He died on May 25, 1968 in Garmisch-Partenkirchen, Bavaria, at the age of 86. Hans Reinhardt, distinct from Georg Hans Reinhardt, commanded the 31st Panzer Corps during the French campaign of 1940, one of two armoured corps that crossed the Meuse at Sedan and Monterme in May of that year, executing the sickle blow that trapped the Allied army group to the north. He later fought on the Eastern Front in command of armoured forces in the 1941 and 1942 campaigns. He was tried at the High Command trial at Nuremberg and sentenced to 15 years in prison in 1948. Released early in 1952, he died on May 24, 1963 in Straubing, Bavaria, at the age of 73. Hugo Sperle commanded the Condor Legion in Spain between 1936 and 1937, the Luftwaffe unit that participated in the bombing of Guernica on April 26, 1937. The first massive air attack against a civilian population in modern European history, which killed hundreds of Basque civilians on a market day and which Pablo Picasso would immortalize in his best-known painting. After Spain, Sperle rose to command Air Fleet 3 during the Battle of Britain in 1940 and the bombing raids on British cities. Tried in the High Command trial in 1947, he was acquitted, one of the 4 defendants in that process who did not receive a conviction. He died on April 2, 1953, in Munich, at the age of 67, in complete freedom. His acquittal was widely criticized by later historians. The silence that descended on the surviving generals of the Third Reich after the 1950s was not the result of a deliberate plan. It was the consequence of a convergence of political, social, and cultural factors that discouraged public examination of their trajectories. The government of Konrad Adenauer had promoted a narrative of the professional soldier detached from the National Socialist political apparatus. This idea, that there was a clean Wehrmacht that only fought while the SS perpetrated the crimes, was a myth useful for the political reconstruction of West Germany, but historically untenable. The Himmerode Report of 1950, produced at the Himmerod Monastery near Kilburg by a group of former generals summoned by Adenauer, set the conditions for the creation of the Bundeswehr. Among their demands was recognition that German soldiers had served honorably. This document directly influenced the Allied decision to review the sentences of war trials. Between 1949 and 1952, the Consultative Commission on Clemency reviewed more than 1,200 cases. Feldmarschals and generals such as Kesselring, Manstein and von Lieb were released years ahead of schedule. In practice, the new republic rebuilt its officer corps on the basis of the Wehrmacht's experience, albeit under parliamentary supervision. The founding of the State Justice Center, Zentrale Stelle, in Ludwigsburg in 1958 attempted to relaunch investigations into Nazi crimes. But his early investigations concentrated on the death camps and SS personnel, not on Wehrmacht commanders. By the end of the 1950s, most of the generals prosecuted or imprisoned had been released. Social reintegration was a fait accompli. The archives of the Bundesministry of Defense show that between 1955 and 1960, more than 2,000 applications for recognition of service ranks and pensions of officers of the former army were processed. Most were accepted. In practice, the new republic rebuilt its officer corps on the basis of the Wehrmacht's experience, albeit under parliamentary supervision and within the constitutional principles of a democracy.